right, welcome everyone. I see people are coming on in. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes to arrive and then we will get going. As you're coming into the room, you can just notice that we have our chat open today, and we also have the Q&A box here at the bottom of your screen open. So there will be an author Q&A at the end of this talk. So if you have any questions that you formed during the talk or that you already have, you can go ahead and post those into the Q&A box at the bottom. That's the best place for them to go so they don't get lost in the chat. Meanwhile, if you're chatting with others, just make sure that you set your chat to all panelists and attendees, and that means that you'll actually be talking to one another rather than to just the panelists who may or may not be reading while they are discussing. So we're just going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes and then we will get going. So welcome everyone, and if you want to sound off where you're tuning in from, that's always fun to see. I think a couple of us are here in Boston and thereabouts, Cambridge. All right. So I think we're going to get going. Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Joanne Samuel Goldblum and Colleen Shaddox in conversation with Sana Fidel. My name is Alex, and I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is the very first time that you're even hearing about us, welcome. We are really happy to have you here as part of our community tonight, and we appreciate your support of the authors and an independent bookstore through your purchases and through your attendance. The chat and the question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so you can talk to other attendees. And please make sure that if you have questions for the Q&A, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window so they're not lost in the chat. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Opening the event this evening, we have Lynn Margario. Lynn is the founder and CEO of Cradles to Crayons, a national nonprofit launched in 2002, which provides children living in poverty with everyday essentials. The organization serves children from birth through age 12 who are living in homeless or low-income situations and provides them with the essential items they need to thrive at home, at school, and at play. They supply these items free of charge by engaging and connecting communities, and they say, our vision is that one day every child will have the essentials they need to feel safe, warm, ready to learn, and valued. To date, the organization has served more than 2 million children facing the national crisis of children's clothing insecurity. Lynn is a leader in the fields of social justice and children's issues, and we're very pleased to have her introduce her organization and tonight's event. Welcome, Lynn.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. I'm really excited to be here. And Joanne and Colleen, I'm so glad you've written this book. We need to break the cycle of poverty in this country. Cradles to Crayons has been working with Joanne and the National Diaper Bank Network for many years. They provide us with 750,000 diapers a year, and that's added up to millions and millions of diapers over the years. The National Diaper Bank Network is an incredible resource. Now, Joanne and Colleen talk in their book about the struggles people living in poverty and low income face in meeting basic needs and how some of those needs are not on everyone's radar. Well, Cradles to Crayons addresses one of those hidden needs, a lack of access to adequate, affordable, appropriate clothing, diapers, books, and other essentials for kids. We're one of the largest national nonprofit organizations with this mission. We serve children here in Massachusetts, in Greater Philadelphia, and across Chicagoland. And we are about to roll out a first of its kind online product donation platform, Giving Factory Direct, which will allow people to ship donations of children's clothing from their homes directly to a child who wears that gender and size. In our nearly 20 years of existence, we've provided basic essentials to more than 2.5 million children, which sounds like a lot, but we know that at least 22 million kids in the United States could use our services each and every year. Now, American families spend on average about $13,000 per year for expenses related to their kids. And about 740 of that a year goes to clothing, footwear, and other apparel. $900 goes to hygiene items, supplies for extracurricular activities, and toys. And a family with school-aged children will spend almost $800 on average to get ready for back-to-school time. How could a family of four living in poverty, making less than $26,200 a year, dream of spending this kind of money on their kids? Now, despite working multiple jobs in many cases, parents and caregivers have had to choose between feeding their family, turning on lights, or buying a winter coat to keep their children warm. This was true well before the pandemic, and since COVID, it's only gotten worse. Just recently, I heard about a single mom with four kids. She lost her job to COVID this summer. Many months later, she's still looking for employment. She recently had a baby, and it's been nearly impossible to manage the different needs of all of the children in the home, along with the adjustments of our new norm: COVID, a new baby, and remote learning. One of her children is having a particularly difficult time with everything, and he can sometimes get aggressive if he doesn't get his way. The clothing from one of our kid packs was enough to make that child feel like he was getting attention, and his outbursts lessened for a time. And the money saved from buying diapers and other supplies helped mom cover her bills. It was a big stress reliever all around. When we talk to parents who receive a package from Cradles to Crayons, they tell us that the package is much more than the items inside it. It gives them hope. It lets their kids just be kids. It made them feel like someone cares about them and their family. These are parents and caregivers doing the best job they can for their kids in the face of incredible odds. And while they fight with or maybe fear the systems that are supposed to be there for their health and well-being, systems that are failing them, they feel a glimmer of reassurance that this is not their fault and that they will get through it. It always amazes me how profoundly something so seemingly simple as a package of clothing or a box of diapers can impact a caregiver when they feel like they have nowhere to go, no one to feel supported by. Imagine the potential we could unlock, the hope for a brighter future if, as a society, we put our minds to addressing poverty and breaking down the barriers families like these face. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's really great to hear more about the organization. If you're from the Boston area, you've probably driven by some of their offices before. And it's really good to remember that, you know, in our community, there are these incredible organizations that are doing great work. And there are places very nearby that we can go to be a part of that. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce moderator Sana Fadel. Sana is the Deputy Director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice, CFJJ. Sana is primarily responsible for CFJJ's legislative advocacy and is the lead organizer of the statewide Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Reform Coalition. Citizens for Juvenile Justice advocates for statewide systemic reform to achieve equitable youth justice. CFJJ is the only independent nonprofit statewide organization working exclusively to improve juvenile justice and other youth-serving systems in Massachusetts. CFJJ advocates, builds coalitions, conducts research, and educates the public on important juvenile justice issues. We're excited to have Sana acting as a moderator for tonight's event. As you can see, coming at this from several angles and dealing with the ways in which poverty and other forms of justice interact. This is a very exciting panel, and I'm very happy to have the people that we do as a part of it. Lastly, it's my privilege to introduce tonight's authors. Joanne Samuel Goldblum is CEO and founder of the National Diaper Bank Network, encompassing more than 200 member organizations that provide diapers and other basic needs to families across America. She's worked on many projects for health justice and access. Colleen Shaddox is a print and radio journalist and activist. She left daily newspapers when an editor reprimanded her for writing too many stories about poor people and went to work in a soup kitchen. She's had one foot in journalism and one in nonprofits ever since. In states throughout the country, Colleen has worked on winning campaigns to get kids out of adult prisons, to end juvenile life without parole, and to limit shackling in juvenile courts. Together, they have collaborated on a book that suffers absolutely no delusions as to the severity, extent, and terrible risks of American poverty. Under our current structures and policies, those who are poor more often than not remain poor, and poverty is a life-threatening condition. It cuts individuals and communities off from everything from safe housing to food to eat to education to rest to basic health care. In Broken America, the authors break down what it means to be poor in the United States and, crucially, what changes in policy and approach we can fight for to alleviate the acute need experienced by many of us. I'm very happy to welcome Joanne Samuel Goldblum and Colleen Shaddox to the stage.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Lynn, for sharing with us the important work of Cradles to Crayons. I'm now very excited to have this conversation with Colleen and Joanne about their book, Broken America. So we'll start with our first question. So the deeply rooted narrative in the US contends that despite its shortcomings, this remains the land of opportunity, and those who end up in poverty ultimately have only themselves to blame. You challenge that frame, arguing it's not the people, but the system we have put in place that is responsible for poverty's continuation. Can you please tell us more about that?
Sure. So, what the basis of what we're talking about is that there's a widening gap between the cost of living and what US workers earn. And the conventional wisdom is that people can work their way out of poverty. But what we'll be talking about more and more is that most people in poverty are employed, but the wages they make don't allow them to pay for the basic necessities of life. So much of what Lynn talked about in her introduction. We feel like the most important thing to come out of this book, our hope, is that people begin to really look at these narratives and try to understand what they mean and why it is that they are not accurate.
So you in the book, you mentioned that the government's definition of poverty leaves much to be desired. So how would you define it?
Yeah, the government definition of poverty leaves out a whole lot of people in poverty. I would define it the way I think most people understand it in their gut, that poverty is not being able to afford your basic needs. So if you can't put food on the table, that's poverty. However, the government measure of poverty excludes so many people for whom that's true. Before the pandemic, we knew that 40% of Americans could not afford at least one of their basic needs. So that told us that nearly half of the nation was at one point in poverty before the pandemic and before the associated recession.
So there's a famous line, give a man a fish and you feed him for the day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. You take issue with that truism being extended to how we think about helping poor people. Why?
So, that saying assumes that there's something wrong with the person, right? That they have a lack of knowledge, a lack of ambition, a lack of skill. And our society has this really, it's a horror about supplying people with things that society feels they didn't earn. When someone is hungry, the sensible thing to do is to give them food. And once they're properly nourished, then you can talk to them about their fishing skills. But it's possible that they have great fishing skills, but that they live in an area where, maybe pollution killed off all the fish, or it's a landlocked state, or they're too weak with hunger to actually get to the place where they could fish. And so, what we really want to think about and focus on is that everything starts with basic needs. Imagine trying to do something really important when you haven't eaten. It's just not possible.
So in order to truly understand poverty in the US, you're right that it's critical to understand how it reinforces and is reinforced by other forms of repression. Say more about that.
Yeah, so Reverend William Barber always uses the phrase interlocking, right? That like poverty and racism are interlocking evils. And when things interlock, they make each other stronger. You could say the same for sexism, discrimination against people with mental illness, educational inequity. There are all sorts of oppression is sort of a team sport with many players working together. I will give you an example. Wealth discrepancies. We know there's a huge racial wealth discrepancy. So how do most middle-class people in the United States gain wealth? Home ownership. And we know that there have been policies, deliberate policies, that keep people of color from owning homes, including redlining, which we think of as historical, but in 2019, there was a major redlining case that was settled in Connecticut with a consent decree. It's going on. Ways that neighborhoods are appraised in value really reflect who lives there. There's all sorts of things actually making it harder for people of color to gain wealth. And that's just one example. We could go into sexism and wages. There's every form of oppression collaborates with the other. And I will also say that they all collaborate to make us content to let poverty continue in this very, very rich nation. We have incredibly damaging stereotypes about people in poverty. And most of those stereotypes, they're essentially racist stereotypes.
You assert that poverty is either going to get much better or much worse in short order. Why do you predict monumental rather than moderate or no change?
You know, we do, because the pandemic has really worsened and brought to light the already unacceptable level of economic inequality in this country. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities surveyed people in November, and nearly a third of respondents said their households were having trouble paying their bills. Now, some of the things that a lot of politicians really tout as ways to end poverty. So for example, the earned income tax credit is amazing. It's really important, but it isn't going to solve poverty. What we've seen in the last months and years is that people, average Americans, are beginning to see how unacceptable the economic inequality is. And so the question is, are we as people going to be able to get our leaders to follow us? And we believe, Colleen and I believe, that we can do that. And that will lead to monumental change.
While depictions of poor people focus on people of color, they're not the average American in poverty. What is the face of poverty in this country today?
It's really a white child. The largest single racial group in poverty are white people, and the age group most likely to be in poverty are children, particularly infants. And certainly people of color are in poverty at a higher rate because of some of the racist structures that I alluded to before. But the fact that the media portrays poverty as something that is just happening to people of color really allows white Americans to other the problem. And as I said, like all these racist stereotypes play in. And people who don't want to solve poverty make use of that. Ronald Reagan's welfare queen was pretty classic. You look at other wealthy countries that do a much better job at establishing a social safety net, for example, like the Northern European countries, there's not a lot of diversity there. So racism hasn't sort of perverted the response to poverty the way it has here Whenever you hear a discussion about cutting SNAP or cutting WIC or cutting any kind of social good program, the undertone is clearly racist. They're each other's evil twin, poverty and racism in this country.
And that's so true. In the work I do, it's like everything,
Yes.
racism defined by poverty, poverty defined by racism. And this is so true in so many ways. Because of a century of government policy has created communities wherein affluent and poor people rarely cross paths, it is through our media that those lives might be glimpsed. How does our television and cinema portray people living in poverty?
This is actually one of the things that was really interesting when we did research. It doesn't portray them very much. And when it does, they're portrayed in the context of committing crimes, right? There are shows about doctors, but there's not a single show about certified nursing assistants who, we all know are really, really important to the healthcare system. And there was a man who did a survey of the 100 highest grossing US films and found that only 2 of them addressed poverty directly. They were My Fair Lady and Lady and the Tramp. When you see a character in poverty, generally, their poverty is the whole character, is what he found. And he also found that people without money are not seen in the media as complex human beings. They're there to just be a part of the story, and that story is that they are poor.
The methodology for calculating the poverty line emerged from work published back in 1963. It has not been updated to capture the key ways in which our country has changed since then. As a result, what aspects of poverty remain invisible? In what ways might the self-sufficiency standard be a better metric?
Yeah, so I'd like to say that the federal poverty level and I were both created in 1963, and neither one of us particularly cares about keeping up with the times. When the FPL was developed, food was the major expense for households. So it's very tied to food. But of course, the inflation rate in housing and healthcare has been much higher than it has been in food for the past half century. So you've got just a really, really low level. For example, a family of 3, federal poverty level is $21,000. You could be making twice that and really struggle to get by, which is why we define poverty as not being able to meet your basic needs. The self-sufficiency level was a measure developed by the Center for Women's Welfare at the University of Washington. And unlike the federal poverty level, it's specific to communities. So, obviously it costs more to live in Boston than it does to live in rural Ohio. So you would have a different measurement there. And it goes by family size and also by children's age, because it costs more to have a 16-year-old than it costs to have a 4-year-old. It costs more to have an infant than a 4-year-old because of the diaper changes and the childcare and so forth. And that's where benefits should come from, not from this really artificial level that we measure people by that has just no basis in reality.
Water is an issue not just in Flint and Baltimore, but is a growing number of towns and cities across the country. How has water and infrastructure more generally become what you call a poverty issue?
This was also one of the chapters that was, at least for me, the most eye-opening. We have a water crisis in this country, and it is a crisis. A 2017 study by the Michigan State University found that 1 in 10 US households could not afford their water bills. And with climate change and the rollback of environmental regulations, that could get much worse. And so on top of that, most water systems are so old that they are prone to breakage, and many, not just Flint and Baltimore, contain lead. And, the question of how we got to that is because as a country, we underinvest in infrastructure. We need to spend vast sums to bring local systems up to snuff. And communities generally do that by hiking prices for ratepayers. So in many cases, in order to make a system safe, a community makes water unaffordable. And sort of our unwillingness to invest in infrastructure generally is more harmful to people with few resources of their own. So, for example, if there's no reliable public transit in your community, the solution is to use a car. But that's beyond many people's means. And so people with their own money, with more money than they might need, compensate for bad infrastructure. But people who don't have extra money can't compensate in that same way. And one of the other things that we feel like is really important to talk about is that, rather than supporting the viability of struggling water utilities across the country, many corporations are being given a free ride. And while poor residents suffer shutoffs with really significant regularity, we allow the people who bottle water to pay less than the consumer who gets it out of a tap. Licensing on huge bottling operations on public land literally costs a few $100s a year, and so that poses a different kind of danger, right? For one thing, it wastes scarce resources because a lot of the water evaporates in the bottling process. And those bottles, rarely get recycled, and they end up as pollutants, and they end up in the ocean. And, residential customers are paying the rising rates to upgrade infrastructure, while big users like bottlers and agribusiness get their water cheap. One of the stories we tell in the book is a man who lived in Baltimore and had a lot of different things going on. He was a working man. His water had been shut off for non-payment. He paid $20 a week. He spent $20 a week on bottled water just to flush his toilet. That's outrageous.
The supervisor at a food pantry Colleen used to run objected that the same women were coming in month after month. It's an emergency food pantry, he would say. You can't have an emergency every month. Or can you? Colleen,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can have an emergency every month. In fact, things are designed to create emergencies. As we talked about, the federal poverty level is so low. Any minimum wage worker in this country is earning below the federal poverty level. So they can't pay for food every month, or they can't pay for food and diapers, or they can't pay for food and put gas in the car. There are all these impossible choices being made all the time, which contributes to the chronic stress of poverty that's really well documented and harms people in all kinds of ways. But I want to add that the guy who said that to me is a good guy. He was compassionate. He cared about the guests at the soup kitchen. He actually took a lot of heat for starting the soup kitchen in an area people didn't want it. But he was caught up in this victim blaming cycle that we get into in poverty. He had to believe that these women were somehow spending irresponsibly, weren't planning well. There had to be some reason it was the same women every month. And that reason couldn't have just been that their resources weren't sufficient. And I think what was going on in his head was, like most nonprofits, we didn't have the resources to take care of everyone who needed our help. So you do this mental triage and you decide who's deserving and who's not deserving. And those decisions are so fraught and so based on all sorts of internalized biases that we have. It does a tremendous disservice to the people who come asking for help. I can't tell you how many times we talked to people in the course of writing the book who said things that were really offensive, who said things like, well, you know, they get comfortable on their food stamps. Like, no, nobody gets comfortable on food stamps. People are hungry on food stamps. It's not nearly enough. There's no sort of easy life being in poverty. It is always really rough. But for some reason, we absolutely refuse to believe that. Joanne, why don't you talk about your basic needs curriculum?
Oh, yeah. So, you know, I would say even people in the helping professions come with all sorts of implicit bias. I worked with colleagues at Yale University on something that we call the Basic Needs Informed Care curriculum. And that's to help individuals and organizations think about and do something about those biases. And people full of good intentions still grew up with this culture, you know, with all of the unfair representations, you know, and so I once had, I think what the story Colleen was thinking of, I had a doctor come up to me after I had done one of the Basic Needs Informed Care curriculum sessions, and he said to me, you know, I've been prescribing Prozac for poverty, and I finally understand why it's not working. You know, so it's just a really complicated issue.
You mentioned earlier food stamps. It's formerly called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP.
Mm-hmm.
You admit those SNAP benefits do make a difference for families facing poverty, but they're also built on a number of assumptions that don't translate to the real world. Give us examples.
Sure. So there's one that's just bizarre. A family of 4 is allowed 0.64 ounces of frozen or refrigerated entrees a week. That's about 2/3 of a single fish stick. I mean, you know, it's bizarre. You know, SNAP allotments, the amount of money people get on SNAP, or, you know, what many people call food stamps, are based on something called the Thrifty Food Plan, which simply doesn't work in real life. And in addition to the silly amounts of food, like the 0.64 ounce of frozen entree, the plan presumes people will spend almost triple the time that the average family does on food preparation. So, you know, you can't get that bag of salad mix to get something healthy on the table. And what makes it even harder is that we're talking about families where it's very common for the adults to be working multiple jobs to get by. But having said all of that, we know that SNAP benefits increase high school graduation. And we know that high school graduation is a really important indicator for future success. So SNAP is really important and does a lot of really positive things, but it is always on the chopping block. It always requires a huge amount of advocacy to get passed. And many people think, many US Americans say things like, if you can't afford to feed yourself or your family, you should just have to figure something out. You know, people don't think that we should provide food, which, you know, is, to me, it's cruel, and I don't really understand it. But yeah, no, SNAP does do a lot of good things. It certainly could do a lot better, a lot more.
The single largest government program that supports housing in this country isn't for affordable housing subsidies, but for the mortgage interest deduction. What shifts do you recommend the government implement to bring our policy in line with actual need?
Well, the money should follow the need, right? And right now the money is running as fast as it can away from the need. Our government has really gotten out of the business of creating affordable housing, or even putting funding structures in place that would encourage affordable housing. Section 8 is a joke. I spent a week with homeless men in California who talked about not even wanting to sign up anymore because it just wasn't worth the trip to the office. You'd just stay on for years and years on the list and you'd never get anywhere. So we're not devoting money to housing on a federal level at all. However, I don't want to let states and localities get off the hook. A lot of the reason that housing is so expensive in this country is local zoning, which is devised to be segregationist and elitist and really make housing more expensive than it needs to be. One of the best resources that we found doing the book was this Obama administration toolkit for local planning and zoning commissions about putting regs in place that would increase affordable housing in your community while also taking care of conservation and other concerns. And a great thing that we suggest you can do is you can get on your planning and zoning commission. I mean, not a lot of people are lined up to do that. It's boring work, but people can really make change on the local level, on the state level, on the federal level. We really need to be attacking poverty at every entry point that's available to us.
Well, one can find innumerable experts speaking and writing about the intractability of homelessness or proposing a Byzantine network of services necessary to remedy it. You contend that it would actually be very simple to fix the vast majority of homelessness. Really?
Yeah, well, just like housing, just like poverty is a lack of money, housing is a lack of a home, right? And most people who find themselves without a home because of finances. Their pay just doesn't stretch to cover the rent. And given what we know has happened relative to wages and housing costs, that's inevitable. Of course, homelessness is increasing and has been, really precipitously since the 1980s. So what we need to do is spend money getting people housing. The myth that is promulgated all over the place is that homeless people are homeless because they have a mental illness or they have a substance abuse disorder. This is not to say that nobody who's homeless has a mental illness or a substance abuse disorder and that those people shouldn't get immediate and high quality help. But for most people, the homelessness begins as a financial issue. And I would add that if you're trying to fix people, which is what we always do as a response to poverty, I can't imagine therapy working all that well if you don't have a home, if you can't feel safe, if you can't have a place to rest. It's just kind of, it's that pyramid of basic needs. We really need to concentrate on getting people into housing as a first step.
So most people shudder at the thought of food insecurity. We get it. We feel it. We worry about it. But less so at the mention of energy insecurity. Those ramifications are wide-reaching. Give us examples.
Sure. So one example is, the US doesn't like to keep people in the hospital very long. So people go home with all sorts of complicated medical machinery that require power. We interviewed one family where the elderly mom was on a breathing machine, an oxygen machine, and the power company shut them off with no warning. And that was after her adult son called and begged them to leave it on until he could change the prescription so that he would be able to get his mother something that didn't require power. And it was a life-threatening situation, and this woman also has dementia and was incontinent. So when her children, in order to wash her sheets, heated up water on a barbecue and washed the linens in the tub. And, yes, people can do that. but it's unacceptable. There are so many risks going on there, right? The risk of, first off, her health, but then the risk of, this was in a New England state, you know, the risk of extreme heat, the risk of extreme cold. And then what happens is people use things like ovens and space heaters, and you're lowering the indoor air quality and you're creating significant fire hazards. These are really dangerous. And one of the things that I think most US Americans who've not experienced it don't know is that if you have an outstanding debt to a utility, renting an apartment is extremely difficult. The bills follow you wherever you go. And, you know, lots of people hear stories anecdotally about families who open accounts in their children's name so that they are able to keep their utilities on. And that is another area where it becomes so risky for children, because then when they go off on their own to try to get an apartment, they have bills following them already. And it comes out of desperation.
So one plan to provide power to those living at or below the 150% marker of the federal poverty guideline, called the Percentage Income Payment Plan. And that's already up and running in 5 US states. How does it work?
It's actually amazing. This is one of my favorite things that we learned about in the book. And the idea is that you pay for power on a sliding scale, with the lowest income families paying very little. There's usually mandatory participation in a conservation program, and that goes along with it. The city of Philadelphia did it as a way to keep people in their homes. And if you can't afford your heating bill and you can't get help with it, you may just walk away and move in with a friend or relative. So neighborhoods actually become more stable when you stop housing loss from unpaid utilities. So we really are excited to talk a lot about the percentage income payment plan, because we think it could be a real game changer.
At its best, public transportation can connect poor people with employment that might help them rise out of poverty. But neglected transit systems across the country are instead making poor people vulnerable to a host of other risks, such as?
Well, one of them is certainly arrest. Fare evasion is a popular reason to arrest people. A number of municipalities have done studies of fare evasion arrests, and they found that there's incredible racial disparity in who actually gets arrested. Think of the amount of money that a person costs the system for that $3 fare evasion. You know, I mean, it would just be so much cheaper to let them go or yell at them or whatever. Another risk is predatory lending. Our transportation systems are really designed for the last century, when a lot of people lived in the urban core and worked in the urban core. Now, those areas have become so gentrified that people in poverty are moving farther and farther away from that core. So it's often very difficult, if not impossible, for them to get to a job. New York City did a study on this, and people who were in the home healthcare industry worked in the outer boroughs, lived in the outer boroughs, excuse me, almost exclusively, but had to come to work in Manhattan. And because the subway lines were so unreliable in the outer boroughs, they were constantly late. And, you know, you and I can be late for work and we say, hey, I'm sorry, and we make up the work. But you can't be late when you're a home health aide. You get fired. So what people turn to are buying cars. The automobile ownership rate has actually gone up for people in poverty, but they're very vulnerable. They can't qualify for conventional financing. So there are these things called buy here, pay here car lots, where the auto dealer is both the seller and the lender. and they will approve people with absolutely horrible credit to buy lemon at inflated prices. And people invariably fall behind on the bills. They get the car repossessed. That's okay. The seller got way more than it was worth already just in the short period they owned it, and then he sells it to somebody else. Your attorney general actually did a very good job of shutting down a couple of these operations, but they keep springing up because the business model makes sense. People don't have an alternative, so people are going to enter into bad deals for cars. I talked to one woman who was paying off a car that did not work, and also the loans for 2 dead cars that she had bought before that. And she knew that was crazy, but she also knew she didn't have an alternative. She had to get her kids to school and she had to work, and there was no other way for her to do it. There was no public transportation available to her.
Well, it makes sense that clean people are healthier as well as more likely to attend school and work. Hygiene is one facet of poverty that rarely gets discussed. What are some other ways hygiene plays out in the lives of people living in poverty?
You know, this is really what I think about all the time, and sort of, the basis of the work at the National Diaper Bank Network. It's enormously important. It is the first thing we notice about people when we're talking to them. If they're clean, if they look put together, if they smell. Kids who show up to school dirty get teased, and sometimes they get reported to child welfare. And, there are times when that's really important, but we tend to connect poverty with neglect, and that's just not the case. Children shouldn't be removed from their parents' custody because their parents can't afford to get them the things that they need. We talked to one woman who had grown up on a Navajo Indian reservation that didn't have water, and that's not uncommon on Indian reservations. So there's one bath, one clothes washing a week. And she dropped out of school rather than put up with her classmates' comments. And keep in mind, you can get assistance for food and housing, and not enough, not nearly enough, but it does exist. And right now, there's no federal program to pay for toothpaste, laundry detergent, toilet paper, diapers. And diapers are the thing that, I've spent the last 18 years talking to anybody who'll talk to me about. And, think about it. You have a baby sitting in mess, uncomfortable and crying. And if you can't change them to a clean diaper, you can't do anything. And, I was lucky enough to do research with some Yale colleagues that associated diaper need with maternal stress at an incredibly high level. And that's not surprising, but on top of that, most childcare centers require parents to provide a supply of disposable diapers. Some don't, there are those that don't, but most do. And our research with the Diaper Bank of Connecticut shows that in these families, adults miss an average of 4 paid work days a month as a result of this. So, that is huge and so easy to address.
So I just want to give a time check for all the audience. We're winding down. So if you have any questions, if you can start putting those in the Q&A slot while we keep going and the interview piece. Mm-hmm. So our government actively steers poor women into training programs that you mentioned in your book that will make them employable only in poverty level jobs. Really?
Yeah, really. The most common job that someone is trained for when they're on temporary assistance for needy families, which is sort of the bare bones of what's left of cash welfare in this country. The most common job that they are trained in is to be a certified nursing assistant. Now, this is a good and noble thing to do. We talk to a lot of women who were CNAs. They love their job. They know that it's important. They know that they're helping people, and they are invariably poor. They make extremely low wages, and they never get raises. They get cost of living raises, but I spoke to a woman who had been doing the job for more than 25 years really well, never gotten a raise. There's no career ladder. There's no way up. Most often they don't get health insurance as a paid benefit. So why in the world would you send a woman toward that job? And I've got a few answers. You do it because it works on paper. You can get trained as a CNA pretty quickly. They get hired pretty quickly. So it's a success rate. I've gotten you off TANF, but I haven't gotten you out of poverty. I've really set you on a track to continue on in poverty.
So something that one of our attendees asked, I'll ask you as well. So back when you were finishing Broken America, several Senate proposals were pushing national jobs guarantees programs that would provide a $15 an hour job with benefits for any US American who wants one. What's the status of those proposals today?
Well, it's actually really interesting. Just today, Representative Ayanna Pressley announced her plan to introduce a resolution calling for federal job guarantees. And as the nation continues to struggle with economic recovery, Pressley says it's time to finish the work of Black women, civil rights leaders, and economists. So the proposal is that we would have federally funded jobs, which would be implemented locally. And the focus would address community infrastructure, child care, elder care, environmental protection, and other sort of neighborhood strengthening types of jobs. And she really believes, and I'm so excited about this, that a federal job guarantee with a $15 minimum wage is a part of addressing the persistent income and wealth gap for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous workers. And it would provide community members the opportunity to work with dignity. And that's what's so important, right? Is that to have true employment, we have to have a living wage. And that is right now, the idea is that it will be $15 an hour, which, as somebody mentioned in the chat, it's not enough, but it is a really good place to start.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it now to Alex to go on to the questions in the chat.
Hi, thank you all. This has been really incredible and broadly reaching conversation. I'm so happy to hear all of the different facets that you've managed to touch on in this brief period of time. Now I cannot hear anyone. There we go. We do have some questions from the audience that I would love to ask. So Mary Ann says, there's talk again about raising the minimum wage to $15 by 2025, but I read recently that if the minimum wage had kept pace with inflation and cost of living, it would now be $22. I think 1978 was the base year. Thank you for this discussion.
Thank you. Yes, we don't think 15 is enough either, but if that's what we can get, we're going to grab it and say thank you and come back and try again tomorrow to push it farther.
Yeah, well, what you were saying before about the realistic level of income that you could have and still be unable to cover your bills, like that does still fall within that range pretty clearly, depending on where you're living.
Right. I mean, it's
so
usually
it's-
the self-sufficiency wage is usually above $20 an hour.
Yeah, no, it's
Right.
yeah, definitely a significant difference. I'm glad that people are already sort of like looking ahead towards the
Right.
next step up the ladder that needs to be fought for. Lyle says, young or emerging adults are disproportionately harmed by the justice system, disproportionately impacted by COVID because of depression and disengagement. And what is their role in the struggle with poverty?
So that's a great question. We always have money to incarcerate people between, say, 18 and 25. And they are the largest age cohort incarcerated around the country because there's nothing magical about your 18th birthday. Brain development goes on into the mid-20s. People are highly reactive at this stage. They're highly influenced by their peers. There's all sorts of reasons why they don't really belong in the adult criminal justice system, which is a whole other discussion. But in terms of economics, they're really getting such a raw deal. We're talking about people who are burdened with incredible educational debt
Mm-hmm.
that they, work off as a barista. We don't really create a ladder for people to get into the economy, to enter into the economy. We haven't done that for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And COVID is making it that much worse. We know that the mental health impacts of COVID are probably worse on emerging adults than any other age group. We're talking about an age group that really wants to assert itself, assert its independence, begin a life. And so many of them are forced back with mom and dad because housing is so expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Wages, if you're lucky enough to get a job now, don't keep pace. And we really know that low wages at the beginning of a career have a ripple effect throughout a career and are going to affect lifetime earnings, are going to affect, retirement. Will there be Social Security for this generation? I have no idea. I don't even know if I'm going to get it. So we need to do much, much better by emerging adults. Much, much better.
It's a struggle to see too, because you have people coming into the world who have wonderful ideas, wonderful skills, wonderful talents, and it's just at the moment it's such a repeat of what, for example, I experienced when I was first leaving college. Was the big like 2008 2000 through 2010 recession, and it seems to be all of those things, but with every single factor even worse. And it's really gutting to not know. We didn't really get a big step up after that point generationally. And it's hard to know what we can do for the generation after us when we're seeing that same struggle, and as a cohort don't necessarily have the resources to help them come out of that struggle, which we obviously don't want to see replicated. It's just, yeah, it's very rough, very bad to see. Let's see. So we do have one more from Carrie, and it is 8 o'clock. So I guess we'll close out with this one, which I think is a great closing question, which is, hello, thanks for this great discussion. My question is, amidst all of this information, what gives you hope?
So, there's a lot that gives us hope. One thing specifically that gives me hope is, through the National Diaper Bank Network, you heard Lynn talk about Cradles to Crayons. They are doing amazing work in Boston and beyond. And we have hundreds of members doing this work across the country, giving diapers, other basic necessities, period supplies to people who need them free of charge. And that is people who see a need in their community and decide to step in and make a change. And I think that if people get anything from this book, it's that poverty is not gravity, right? It is a choice that we make. We can change the way the economic system in our country. And we can make sure every person has their basic needs met. It's completely doable. And that's what gives me hope, is that, there is hope. Objectively, we can change things. And so it's just a matter of getting out there and doing it.
And I want to add something. You give me hope, Alex,
Yes.
that you are concerned about emerging adults. I think that my generation is far too fond of saying, well, nobody helped me and I turned out fine. Well, obviously you didn't if you think it's okay for other people to suffer. I see so much more altruism and activism among younger people than I do among my own generation. I mean, look at the Black Lives Matter movement. That was young people who shook the country by the shoulders and said, wake up, this is unacceptable. So I just hope that we were more successful as mothers than advocates.
Oh, well, thank you both so much. I can't wait to dig further into this book. I'm so happy to have been here, hearing you both speak this evening. Sana, thank you so much for moderating. And thank you to everybody who's in the audience for joining us tonight. It has been asked, was this recorded and will there be a link? It was recorded, and once we post the video, we will share that with everybody who registered. So you will be able to revisit this great talk. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Sana. And thanks to the crowd. A lovely, lovely evening.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you all.
And Sana and Lynn. Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
Sana.
Good night.